Hi, my name is Looney, and this is part 2 of my watercolor tutorial. I'm taking it step by step. What I'm going to be doing on these, I'm going to try and put closed captions on all my tutorials. There will be timestamps also down in the description block, and that helps you to skip to the areas that you want to review, or skip past some areas that you don't want to review. I'm going to try and post a long version and a short version, and doing so, please give me some feedback in the comments and let me know what you think about that. This is going to be the long version, and if you want to skip out on it, you see that yellow hand up in the corner. This link, you can click it and it can take you to the short version. These are some of the points that we covered in the first half, and we're concentrating on the last two, painting step by step and finishing without a matte glass in this particular piece. This is the finished product and the thumbnail that I worked on. It's 8 by 10, 140-pound watercolor paper on wood stretcher bars. And I'll show you how to finish it out. A reminder, when you're working with your watercolors, be sure and have a watercolor pencil. This particular one is a gray, a neutral. They're handy. It's better to have than your lead pencils. And the brushes I'm using on this one, mostly it's the number 12 round. I've got a number 2 and a chisel and a dipstick. I didn't use the latter very much at all, actually. Here's my supply list along with the paints that I used. Oh, by the way, if you're wondering what that little orange tip is on my brushes, I teach classes and that's how I mark them so my students don't inadvertently walk off with my brushes. Here's my palette, and you can see I've got cool colors on one side and warm colors on the other. I don't tend to clean my palette very often because I actually like all of that mud and those mixed colors. I will utilize those. I do clean the tray and the wells when I need to. The colors predominantly used on this piece are listed here. Some of those more so on the thumbnails than the finished piece, but these are all Grumbacher colors except for, as you saw on my palette, miscellaneous and mud colors. Listen to this. That is watercolor paper stretched on a canvas, stretcher bars. It is tight as a drum and a very nice surface to work on. Here is the photograph from my files that I worked with, and I went into detail in the first half on how I sketched it, or I actually traced it on tracing paper and modified the composition to tighten in the other two elements, the seed head and the smaller version of the flower, because I wanted to have a lot of white in this piece on the corners, and so pulling those elements up allowed me to do that. And I did not want to paint all of the background, all those stems and all those leaves. I'm just going to put indications of them as you saw that finished product. I had an idea of where I wanted to go with this, but I didn't want to do total realism. Here is the sketch in place to show how it worked, and then here is the tracing. And again, you can take that watercolor pencil and modify it. Now I'm working on thumbnails. Folks, I can't stress enough how helpful these are. This is a great place to work out your issues and your problems and try different things, especially if you're a beginner. But even so, for the veteran, this is an excellent way to work your problems out. I'm working these thumbnails just the same as I'm going to be doing the big piece. In other words, I'll be putting my yellows down, my sunshine, I call it, and then as the stages dry, then I'll work in other colors. The size of these thumbnails is standardized. I work on a standardized size, which is a 2.5 by 3.5. And that's the size of an ACEO, which is an art card edition or original. And I'll talk more on that in another video, but not here. After putting down the sunshine, I'll go in and start building with my reds and my oranges. Those colors that I talked about before, it was a cool yellow and a warm yellow, and a cool red and a warm red, and a cool green and a warm green, and then the purples. If you don't know your color wheel or color theory, there's lots of videos on YouTube that can talk about that. It's key to the success or failure of a lot of paintings. Here I'm laying in some of the background color. I'm working fairly fast and pretty wet, so I'm gonna blot here in a minute, but anyway, this is primarily using complementary colors. And again, if you don't know a lot about color theory, it's key to punching colors and helping other areas. For instance, this one I'm actually kind of outlining the yellow on the petals with purple, because purple is across the color wheel from yellow, therefore it is its complementary color. And if you want a color to pop, then you put a complementary color next to it. If you want to dull a color or gray a color like yellow, and you don't want it very bright, you add just a touch of its complement in there. By all means, please do not use black or Payne's gray to make your shadows or your colors. I seldom, if ever, use black. I will use a number of other colors blended together to make my darks. Here I'm building with the oranges and the reds, and I'm going back and forth from the flowers to the background, letting them dry or set up in between. This particular thumbnail I'm working fairly wet, and I'm trying to rush it. And I'm not working for a lot of detail. Your thumbnails just basically need to be a color sketch. You don't want to spend a lot of time on them. And I did 6 in all for this particular project. I treated all of the flowers basically the same way. I treated the composition basically the same way. The only thing that really varied from one thumbnail to another, and you'll see that in a little bit, is that background color. In some of them it's cooler, in some of it's warmer, in some of it's more whimsical, in others it's more realism. And once I laid all of those out, then I made my decision on which way I wanted to go. It's also a great way to travel. I have a lot of folks in my classes who are retired, and they travel quite a bit, but doing small works like this, it's a wonderful travel size, and then you've got a nice record of some of your ideas or things that you were contemplating, and you can pull those out later and use those to work from. You can see my actual photograph up in the corner. These are from my photo files. Now with an iPhone, it's very easy to snap pictures and have files. So I have files on my computer of potential subjects that I'd like to work on. Some of them I get to, some of them I just continue to accumulate. But this is one actually from some years back. And this is a subject that I'm very familiar with. I've been painting these flowers for decades, 30, 40 years. So I'm familiar with it, but I'm going through this process to show the different levels for beginners as well as experienced artists. And you notice I'm not putting a lot of detail in that background. The background is more or less just a vehicle to make my flowers pop out and show better. And this particular one, I usually don't have turquoise in my palette in those 18 cups. So what I have done is simply open up the tube and I'm painting straight out of the tube. I'm dipping it straight out of the tube. I don't recommend it. You're going to hear me a lot giving you advice on do what I say and not what I do. But after all of these decades, folks, I'm not going to change. I'm sorry. Hopefully you will develop better habits as you venture into your painting career. Almost everything that I did as on the thumbnails as well as on the finished product is with this number 12 round brush. It comes to a very fine point. I can get very straight lines, or I can push down on the brush and get a broader stroke. These are the thumbnails. And see, they're alike, but they're not. And out of the 6, I chose the one with the darkest, most dramatic background. And it actually varies from the one on the far left, which is dark greens. This one has quite a bit of purple in it. But there's my selection, and I might save those for another project in the future. So now doing the same thing that I did with my thumbnail. Again, this piece is 8 by 10 inches. The paper is actually hot press, which I don't normally have available. But when I decided to do this demo, I did it in the evening and I pulled out my papers, and I actually didn't have a 140-pound cold press big enough to go on the frame, but I did have hot press. So that was the reason for the choice on this one. And also when you're stretching the paper on the frame, 300-pound is just too stiff. It would break as you're stretching. And again, if you want to see that whole process, go to part 1. I'll put up a link right in here so that you can do that very thing. But this is a very smooth finish. It doesn't have much texture or roughness to it at all, which lends itself very nicely to illustration. And you will see on this finished piece when we get into close-ups that there's a lot of fine detail. All right, now I'm letting the petals dry. I've laid in some of the yellow, and I'm going in and just put a little indication of those stems and leaves. You can see my photo reference up in the upper left-hand corner, as well as I've kept the thumbnails spread around. So I'm using all of those as reference. And you can see I'm using the brush almost perpendicular to my paper. And by doing so, I can get a very fine line, very detailed line. And I'm just beginning to pull in a little detail and define my petals a little bit more. And there's not much bleeding because that yellow has set. We're not really working wet on wet. Okay, as I'm continuing to add color, you notice I'm still working with the brush load of color that I started with. That's another advantage of using a larger brush, is its capability of holding a lot. Now I'm pushing down more and I'm getting a broader stroke. See how that differs? Same brush, I haven't changed brush. I haven't dipped into more color yet because I've had a lot on the brush to work with. So many times my beginners that come in, they want to go for the detail right away. They want to go for that little tiny brush. I usually go around and whack knuckles. Oh, especially folks who have been working that way for a long time. It's really hard to break those bad habits. Okay, now without doing any more on the flowers, I'm switching and going in with my purple, which is the complementary color to the yellow. And I'm beginning to just lay in some background color to establish the direction and the feel of the background, as well as, now you see I'm laying it on its side, the brush on its side, and I'm also carrying the painting over the edge of the paper. I do this a great deal with acrylics. I'm mostly an acrylic artist, but I had quite a bit of interest and requests for watercolor. I'm familiar enough with it to get folks started and to give them an opportunity to try the medium and the materials to see if they like it before they go out and do a major investment of materials and supplies that are either wrong, because in watercolor, cheap is really cheap, and it'll work against you. Cheap paper, you'll fight it, and cheap colors, they're grainy and they don't have much pigmentation, so they're not very rich, and you just simply won't have very satisfactory results. But you can see, again, I'm going around the petals and I'm defining the shape of the petals utilizing the background, but I'm not doing any major detail of the stems or the leaves. All right, that area over there is beginning to dry out. I'm intensifying the colors, and especially, you notice I might draw the detail around the piece, but then I go and soften it up, broaden it up. And I will continue to move from the background to the flowers, from the flowers to the background. I'm not going to be doing any area in full detail. Something else I tell my students when they come in, I ask them to keep an open mind. They may hear something from another artist working in that particular medium that's 180 degrees for what I'm telling them. All of it you take with a grain of salt, folks. I will be showing you lots of different techniques with different mediums. And sometimes these are hacks or tricks that I've learned along the way. I do not believe there's any one way, right way or wrong way of painting. It varies from one individual to another. When I Now, I have a formal education. Not only did the good Lord gifted me with talent from a very young age. In fact, the first art lesson I ever had was at age 5. And I have been painting, I have been working my entire life. I haven't always worked in the studio. I made a living for a while working and painting billboards when they had to have somebody to actually paint them. I've done scenic design and painting of big giant backdrops, the design and the painting. I have done murals and faux finishes for walls. I did that for many years in the Atlanta area. Each thing that I did, I brought some of the techniques and the works that I had learned. Even on the billboards, I painted them like a giant painting. I had underpainting on them, and then I detailed out. But I was called on when they needed somebody to paint something that looked realistic, like a soda bottle with condensation on it, or a stein that had condensation bubbles on it, or ice cubes. Car dealerships that needed one of their new models to be represented. So I do have the ability to do photorealism. And in my early days in commercial art and in signage, that's what I used a great deal. When I got into doing special events and mural work, that was a little more expressive and a little more painterly. But in my mid-20s, I went back to art school, and I got my degree in painting from the Instituto Allende down in Mexico. I was raised in Central Texas, where the natural palette is very much earth tone. And in Mexico, the mountains of Mexico, it was very much brighter, clearer. The sky was more cerulean blue than in Central Texas, which was more of an ultramarine. Color's very vivid, and I enjoy using a lot of color. All right, and I'm building the color on this work. You notice that I went with a light color, orange, and now I'm going with more of a darker red. But again, nothing anywhere is detailed yet. Everything is a buildup. And as I skip around, that allows those other areas to set up and dry. And I can get a much cleaner line and not so much of a bleed, not in this particular piece. The orange red that you see is the cadmium red, and the darker red is more of the alizarin crimson. And the areas that actually look as though I was putting black down is the alizarin crimson with a touch of purple and a touch of phthalo green mixed together. Again, I'm using my brush on the side, so I'm getting a broader stroke. And I'm not, remember, look at this, I'm not having to dip back and forth and pull color, pull color, pull color. If I was using a small brush, I would constantly be having to dip back and forth. Oftentimes, when I'm working a watercolor. I'll have two brushes going. I have one loaded with pigment with the color, and I'll have another brush of similar shape that is nothing but clear water, blotted. And if I wind up putting too much pigment down at one time, I can take that other brush and blot it away. Or I can diffuse it depending on what I'm working on. But utilizing a larger brush actually gives you much more versatility. And my strokes are going in the direction of the natural shape of the petals, the centers, the seed head, and the foliage. And again, as a reminder, I've got a shorter version where what I have done during times like this is to simply speed up the film. I slow it down and hit the highlights, but I'm not showing all the painting in real time. And I will be dependent on your feedback to let me know what you think about that and whether or not to offer both. Also, with the closed caption, you can turn the sound down and just read the directions or simply watch. When I first decided to do these videos, when I would film myself or listen to myself, I thought, oh mercy, I can't do this. I'm too vain. But one of my compromises is to do a voiceover and let you watch what's going on, and to do the closed caption. A funny aside, the very first one that I did, I had to go back and edit the closed caption because the program didn't always interpret my Texas twang. I had some very interesting versions of my narrative that were kind of funny. Again, broad strokes. And see, I can switch from the broad stroke to the detail. Now I'm going back to the background. I'm letting the flowers rest. This particular piece is very illustrative in its presentation. I'm going to be doing other ones in this series. The next one is going to be a much looser, more of a technique of wet on wet. It'll be a landscape, but and that'll be on a rougher piece of paper. We'll be using a cold pressed piece of paper. Not necessarily stretched on a wood frame. I'll do something different for that one. Okay, so now as we're going through this, let's review a little bit about what I'm covering in this and what I want you to take away from this particular demo. This is primarily a dry brush technique, not wet on wet, but the areas I'm allowing it to dry before I come in with the next color and the next color and the next color. And that's one of the main reasons for switching back and forth from the flower to the background. But also, so I don't get too tied up with it and try and do too much detail at any one time. I could, because I know where this is all going, but for a less experienced painter, I'd like for you to get into the habit of working your whole piece up at once, whether you're doing a watercolor or an acrylic or just about anything. Don't spend too much area in one little spot doing all your detail, because then that's going to dictate what you've got to do with the rest of your picture. Also, for this series that I will be doing, these 12 watercolor pieces that I'm going to be doing this year, I'm going to emphasize the use of white space. There was, I don't know, maybe 30% of this piece that was completely white paper, untouched. And that will be the basic theme running through all the pieces that I'm going to be doing in this series. The next one, like I said, will be more of a wet on wet. All right, in the watercolor itself, I'm adding light, warm greens, but very sparingly. You'll notice that I'm using more of a stroke instead of that flat area to do broad colors. This is to begin to establish the leaves and the stems. But none of that's going to be detailed. And the end result, you'll see snippets of it, because I want the attention to go on the flowers. I don't want the detail of the flowers to be fighting with the detail of the background. So there'll be just a hint of the greenery, and that's why I also limited the amount of greenery that I put into this, instead of painting the entire thing solidly with stems, leaves, and other greenery back there. This piece is a study in complementary colors. That's why it looks so vibrant, and that's why it has such vitality, is because I'm putting two complementary colors side by side. That's the yellow and the purple. Even though the flowers are worked with red, the colors that are adjacent to each other the most in this are the yellow petals and the purple, the deep purple that's utilized in the background. And those are colors that are crossed from each other on the color wheel. As I'm putting this green over the purple, you'll notice that you get a nice middle ground green where they cross each other and they blend. The interesting thing about watercolors, and you need to do some practice pieces, oftentimes with your scraps would be great, and that's paint down the green first, let it dry, go over it with the purple wash, and then right beside that, put the purple down first and put the green on top. They will look different, and you'll get a different feel depending on which one you put down first. And especially if you're putting a dark one and putting a light one on top. It's not usually done in watercolors. You want to do it the other way around. You start with your lights. You try and preserve your highlights, your whites, and then you continually layer until you get the deepest darks. I'm doing a broad stroke of the orange on the petals because the characteristic of this flower is it almost looks as though the petals have been dipped in yellow. So all of this little fine line work and lining and detailing that I've been doing, now I'm going over all of that with the broad stroke orange to emphasize the flower, but also to make that yellow tip pop out more. You can see where on the petals that I used a wash, then the tips show up better. Watercolor typically will dry a lighter color than what you paint down. Oftentimes I see it with beginners. They tend to use too much water, so they water down their pigments, and it looks great when you put it down on the paper, but then it dries and it looks more washed out. Another thing is working too much wet on wet and not being patient enough to allow those colors to set up. So the next application, it either bleeds out and blends too much with what you have down, so you don't have a separation of either those colors or those values, or it just bleeds into each other. Watercolors can't, if you don't have patience before, you will learn patience as you work with it. Unless, you know, there's lots of different ways of working with it. I mean, you can work it wet on wet. You can do some abstracts, and I may do that in this future series. The only thing I've decided is what I'm going to do for the next one. I haven't made a decision on what the other 10 are going to be. I let that sort of evolve. I get feedback from my students, and if they have a particular thing that they would like to see happening or work on, then I will work that into the agenda. And that's why I ask for your input here in the comments. If there's anything that you would like to see or you're curious about, by all means, shoot me a question or a request in the comments. I definitely am reading those. I see likes. I occasionally see a dislike, but I have no idea why or what. If you don't leave me some kind of something, you don't have to orate, you don't have to write an essay, just a few sentences or a few phrases will be enough to let me know either what you like or what you found lacking in the presentation. This is very new, people, as far as the videos are concerned. I've been talking basically nonstop in my classes for years now. good paper compared to less good paper. Lower quality, or especially, I don't ever go into anything less than 140 pound. That 90 pound, I can just, you throw that away. Use it for Kleenex. I don't care. Don't use it. And it would be too thin. I think it would be very vulnerable for stretching, for punctures. So, so having paper with more body to it, plus the heavier the paper, the more abuse it can take. And with my students, with my beginners, they tend to kill their whites and their lights way too early. And how to get that back, part of that is that dipstick that I showed you in the supply list. That's a great little tool. You can also use a fairly stiff bristled brush. That little chisel is another one that you could use instead of the dipstick, and that would be to just use plain water and very gently, preferably in one direction. Don't sit there and scrub it back and forth while you're trying to erase it. But what you're doing is you're laying water to reactivate that pigment and then blot it up with a clean paper towel or rag. But the paper will have been stained, and you will not get back to white paper. And even if you use the China white, that white paper area and a white painted paper area are going to look different. It's going to look flatter. You've lost the vitality and the life in the watercolor. That's what's so charming about the medium. And all I can tell you to do is practice and practice, and then practice some more. As you do, hopefully you will learn a bit of restraint and being able to save your whites. As I'm learning and as I'm doing trial and error on this, I hate to say, but my last 10 to 15 minutes of filming that showed my finishing this piece and detailing it out was lost due to my inadequacies. But I'm getting better. I will learn. In the meantime, instead of trying to repaint this whole piece all over again, we'll clip to the final shot of the finished piece. And I'm going to zero in on that and detail it more so you can see exactly what I was talking about as far as the layers. I did not set out to try and save every single stem, every single leaf. I didn't want that much detail or that much formal work in the background itself. I wanted it to stay loose. I wanted my flowers to be detailed. I wanted the background to help be a background and not fight with attention with my flowers. So I kept it pretty loose and I kept it pretty broad, but at the same time I didn't want an indication of a stem or a leaf. So in the end it was very drab, for a lack of another word. So in order to break that purple and green area up, that's when I decided to introduce the China white. I don't normally advocate using opaque. Sometimes it happens. In the class, I recommend, even for my rate beginners, I will give them a piece of 300-pound paper which is very heavy. It almost feels like cardboard, and it is expensive. But I want them to experience what really good paper feels like in comparison to the cheap. And I'm going to talk just a minute about putting your signature on your piece. This piece may become framed or it may not. I may put a frame on it, I might not put a frame on it. Usually the lip of the frame is about 1/4 inch deep. I have so many times have beginners who go right down to the very bottom and the very edge and they sign it. When you do that, half of your signature is going to be buried under the frame. So I like to use as a measuring tool just a finger, and you lay that down and you pretend there's an imaginary line. You put your finger on the very bottom edge and an imaginary line above where your finger is, and that's the line. You don't want to go any lower than that when you put your signature. And also for the edge, you want to leave a little air, a little space. Otherwise, your signature is going to run up into the side of the frame. And I have been signing pieces for decades, so I've modified my signature so I can do this with a brush. My L's look more like a capital L, and they're not straight across at the bottom. They have a bit of a loop. Okay, the finished piece, I lost a little bit of film. So you notice that I jumped and I've got a little more detail. After this, I've got some close-ups that will show how I finished out the background. Those dark areas began to get flatter and flatter. I did not try to save any highlights as I was painting it, but what I did do, you can see, is I used a little bit of China white. There's my original photograph that I was working from. And you see, I really bumped it color-wise and compositionally. But I used that China white, and with a small little #2 brush, I went in and just gave a hint of stems and leaves. All right, now this is finishing it out with wax, Dorland's Wax Medium. I've left my recording on as I'm buffing this on so that you can hear where I've applied it. There's less sound, and when my hand reaches a new area, you get this scratchy sound. This will not change the color. You see, there's no differentiation of where I've been and where I've not been. It doesn't change the color at all. I carry it all the way over to the edges. I only did one application on this one. You can do several. But with each application, when you buff it, it's going to get a little more shiny. This is very much a matte finish on this right now. And probably over the whole thing, I haven't used more than a teaspoon of that stuff. After it's set up, that's just a little lint-free cotton scrap of rag, and I'm buffing it in a circular motion just like I did the application of the wax. I showed my students in my class this. I went over and got some water and threw water on this, and some people sucked air. They were shocked because if you do that on a regular watercolor, it's immediately going to start soaking in and lifting or staining or water circling the paint, and it beat it up just like it would on the hood of your newly waxed vehicle. So this is a wonderful alternative to the expense of having to get a mat, especially a custom cut mat and glass and frame. It's just one option. And if you've never seen this or heard of this, I just wanted to introduce it. And this is all done in real time. So if you're interested in future tutorials, please subscribe. And here are links to the other pieces that I was telling you about, the part 1 and the short version.